Well, evening everyone. It's my huge pleasure to welcome you here to Tortoise for the launch of Louise Tickle's debut novel, Between the Lies. I've been a really big fan of Louise's journalism on the family courts and domestic abuse for a number of years. I've followed her work. I've had a number of conversations with her about the family courts and how they work. It's been very helpful for my own journalism. And I'm really proud to say I'm now a fan of Louise Tickle, the author, as well, because I was lucky enough to get a sneak preview of the novel. So I read it a few months ago, and it's definitely a story that really stays with you, but it's still a story that I think about today. So I would really, really encourage you to buy a copy. They're available for sale over there. Get Louise to sign it. I'm sure she'll be more than happy to oblige. And enjoy it, because although it's about quite a difficult subject, it really is, I'm not lying when I say it's a page turner. It's a really fast-paced thriller. So definitely it comes highly recommended from me. What we thought we'd do is Louise and I are just going to have a conversation about the novel. Louise will do a little reading just to give you all a little flavour of Louise's writing, and then we'll open it up to Q&A from all of you at the end as well, and we'll try and sort of keep it to about 45 minutes or so. So first of all, Louise, I guess my first question for you... Oh, I should have introduced myself as well. Sorry about that. My name's Sonia Soda. I'm chief leader writer and a columnist at The Observer. And Louise and I are friends now, but we first met because of Louise's journalism, which I was following. So, but Louise, so I guess the first question that I wanted to ask you was, I followed your writing as a journalist for years. I'm sure lots of people in the audience have. Why did you decide to write a novel?
First of all, it is the oddest thing to be on this side of the interview process. I was sitting here going, this is strange. I haven't done this before. What made me decide to write a novel? I had been going to the family courts for probably about a year or two, and I was always very kind of shocked and indignant that I wasn't allowed to write whatever I wanted to write about what went on in there. And I was butting up against these blocks, which are basically the law saying you can't do this unless you get permission. And there's nothing more guaranteed to rile a journalist than that. And I thought, well, what can I do? And a friend of mine put on a sort of day at our local kind of co-working space. And I thought, I'll go and see if I can dredge a story out of my mind. And I went along, and I found it so hard. But I thought, no, I can write about the things that I'm seeing in a different way if I fictionalise it. And that was one part of it. And the second part was that I had reported for The Guardian on a pretty horrific murder of a woman and her 2-year-old daughter who had been killed the night before they were due to go to the family court in a custody battle for the little girl. And it was really grim, and I went to interview her sister, who shook herself nearly off the seat over the 2 hours I interviewed her, but really wanted to tell her sister's story. And what I didn't know from the reporting was that there had been an older child in that house, the woman's older daughter, who had escaped and had lived to tell the tale. And I started to wonder what happens to the children of women who are murdered, because there are a lot of them. And how do they grow up? And what happens to the relationship with their father? Because their father is going to get out of prison, probably when they're in their mid to late teens or 20s. So how do you grow up as the child of a murdered woman and the daughter of a murderer? And how does the family court interpose itself in that dynamic? And that's where I started.
So it's obviously a work of fiction, but how much of it, and I guess this is something that I wondered when I was reading it, as somebody who knows your work as a journalist as well, how much of it is real and how much of it is based on real stories?
It's based on real things that happen in the family justice system, is how I would describe it, rather than on any one particular case. So as you follow cases through, you start to see themes emerging. So family courts exist to promote the best interests of the children, who are their sole, really, and paramount in law, their paramount concern. And so the decisions that are made are on behalf of children. But when you have either very troubled, very vulnerable adults who are part of that mix, or warring parents with various different reasons for why they're in conflict, you end up with this kind of maelstrom of different dynamics and different themes that come out of it. So it's themes that are accurate and that I've seen happening in court, but no one particular story that I have been able to tell because, yeah, you're not allowed.
And was there a tension for you when you were writing it between the author within you and the sort of creative needs of that relate to writing a novel, and the journalists and sort of the need to be faithful to being accurate about how things would actually play out in a family court that, say, may not work for a novel?
Yeah, that was the most difficult thing, because one of the things that is so unpleasant, I think, when you're reading a work of fiction is when you know that something is so implausible that you can't suspend your disbelief anymore. And so I wanted to there are 3 kind of set-piece court scenes in the novel. And although the period of time over which the novel runs is 5 months, in which time, and there are some family barristers in the audience and they're going to laugh at this, during which time the entire case is resolved, which is just so impossible these days in particular, even though it should be resolved within 6 months. But I didn't want it to be impossible to believe that what went on in the court scenes could happen. And yet it had to be dramatic, and lots of court hearings are not dramatic, but some court hearings are dramatic. They can be really distressing. There's huge amounts of tension within a family court hearing, especially when you have, for instance, somebody who's alleging domestic abuse is being cross-examined. And indeed, when somebody who's being accused of domestic abuse is cross-examined. And I've seen those things happen on a number of occasions. So it had to be accurate, but it also had to be squashed, is how I would describe it. The other thing that I found really hard was, as a journalist, you're not making things up. People might think you are, but you're not. You're not making things up. But with this, I'd never had the freedom to just be so free to go, anything goes, literally anything goes. And at times I was sort of going, well, yeah, but I haven't got the thing in my head. And I had to kind of grind it out at times and think, I've got to make this up. So as a journalist, you don't do that. But as a creative writer, I had to do that and make it plausible. So it was really hard.
Interesting. Do you want to do a reading?
Oh,
now?
It's really hard when you're trying to choose what reading you're going to do, because obviously nobody's actually in the world of the novel. But if I just describe in brief how it starts, there is a young woman whose mother has been murdered and whose brother has died in the same incident. And this is 20 years on, and her father gets back in touch with her from prison, where he still is, because he has never pleaded guilty to the murder of her brother. So he gets back in touch with her and says that he wants her to come and visit, because he wants to explain to her what happened that night. And it happened on the night of her 9th birthday. And so she goes to her aunt and uncle's house in Pembrokeshire. I chose Pembrokeshire because it's a place I really like going. And if this ever gets televised... Sorry?
And that's where I'm from.
Oh. yeah, I know.
There's 2 people who agree here, at least.
And if it ever does get televised, I want to be on that Pembrokeshire cliff top and go back and forth and have a good reason. So her family, her mother's sister, lives in Pembrokeshire, and they adopted her. And her mother's sister is called Maggie, or Mags. So the main character is speaking, and she's called Cherry. It's 9 years I don't have Mags, she said, but I don't really remember. I want them back. Her aunt, interrupted in her careful placing of boiled eggs into egg cups, paused. Only he knows about it, Cherry said. He's the only one who can tell me. You're my family. She saw Mags's body shrink. What to say to get through this, Cherry thought, to make something better that can never be better. She spread her fingers, pressing each one down, fingertip by fingertip, on the scrubbed tabletop. It's about me knowing everything there is. Mags flinched. Cherry took a breath. I want to know what went on before, between them. Her aunt's face bleached. He won't tell you that. She held up a hand. You're expecting the truth now, from him? Cherry heard her aunt's anguish. He will tell you exactly what he wants to tell you. Mags could barely look at her niece. He will find a way to justify himself. That's why he got in touch, no matter what he says. Cherry shook her head. I know he'll have his reasons for writing, she said, but if he wants me to go, he has to give me something back, and I want to find out how he could ever. Margaret turned away. There's no possible way for him to justify what he did. Her aunt was trembling so hard her teeth were chattering. What you really want to know, Mag stumbled over the words, is why we didn't save her, why we didn't bring her here, help her leave, make her safe. And Bill, there was nothing left in Mags now, her voice a sobbing whisper. You want to know why we didn't save Bill. But how do you welcome a man into your home when he's chipping away at someone you love till she can hardly say a word or think a thought of her own? Mags's voice was so quiet, Cherry had to strain to hear. She tried to leave him. You'd come for a weekend and often stayed longer. Then she turned up that last summer and said she wasn't going back. Mags's face flushed. Tom took her hand. We couldn't believe she'd done it, he said gruffly. We got you signed up for a school here. Your mum got a job in the pub. We'd started to convert the barn, Margaret said, got for a place for you. At this, her face collapsed and tears took over entirely. But then he came to see you and Bill, he said. Tom's voice was grim. Stayed a few days. Told your mum he wanted a fresh start, here on the farm, said he'd help me out. Tom looked at Cherry, shamefaced. I said no. You said no? Cherry could hardly push out the words. Mags closed her eyes. Your father would have poisoned our life here. Her voice shook. His moods, his rages. He wasn't welcome. We couldn't pretend. There was some pull he had on your mum, said Tom. After he'd been, she lost faith in herself, packed you all up and went back to Bristol. Cherry felt ice cold. You didn't stop her when you knew what he was like. We'd worked so hard to get you all set up here. We'd done so much to make it work. I was angry, said Mags, her voice not far off a whisper. We didn't know it would cost her life. Or Bill's, were the unspoken words that clanged loud and clear across the scrubbed kitchen table. And so Cherry came to understand that Margaret and Tom, who had brought her up as their own daughter and swaddled her with love since that dazed October afternoon, felt it was their fault that her mother had been killed, and Bill along with her. But Cherry knew different. She knew it was nobody's fault but hers that her brother was dead. So wow. That's that.
Thanks, Louise. I think that's a really powerful passage that will resonate with anybody who's written about domestic abuse or experienced it or had loved ones who've experienced it as well. Cherry is a journalist in the novel. She's obviously the main character. And I wanted to ask you why you made her a journalist. Was it because you're writing what you know, or were there other reasons as well?
Well, I was warned not to. I was warned
Why
quite
not?
strongly not to. So somebody who is a very good screenwriter and a multiply published author, whose advice I really value and whose work I really admire, said to me, look, there's a reason why journalists aren't the main characters in novels, and that's because they tend to be apart, they stay away from the fray, they're kind of quite often sort of passive, they're just listening. And those are all structural problems why it's actually quite difficult to have a journalist, I think, as your main character in a novel, because as journalists, you're not there to kind of grab the action, take charge, run forward, a little bit like, you often get police with a sidekick, or lawyers, in fact. And so in some ways, it kind of feels like a great failure of the imagination to have made her a journalist. But there are advantages to having a journalist, which is that you have access to places that other people don't have. And most particularly because I wanted to write about the family justice system and how it interacted with children's lives, I had to have access to the court. So I sort of had three choices. I could be a social worker, or I could be a lawyer, or I could be a journalist. And if I was going to stay plausible and be as disruptive as I needed my character to be, I couldn't have them being a lawyer. I couldn't really have them being a social worker, because it wasn't plausible for them to stand or act so far outside of their professional obligations and still be able to work because they'd have been disbarred or struck off or whatever. It just wouldn't have worked. So in the end, I made her a journalist, but I had to very deliberately give her more agency by making her be dragged into the action against her will and setting up very uncomfortable moments for her where she was in tension with her professional ethics, in fact. I think Patrick Butler is here, who from Guardian, from The Guardian, who has commissioned me a lot, and one of the characters' first names, the editor, is Patrick, after Patrick. And there is a moment, which has never happened with Patrick and I, where Cherry has been commissioned to do a very difficult story, and eventually, legally, it becomes too fraught, and there's a terrible scene where Patrick pulls the commission and leaves Cherry in despair, so because she's done something so bad.
I think one of the things that it's interesting to see with Cherry throughout the novel is she has to work very hard sometimes to keep that lens of journalistic objectivity and impartiality. And it's very difficult, I think, when you're writing about these sorts of subjects. Kind of, I've been there, I know you've been there. So I guess, I wanted to know kind of how much, sort of why you put that in the novel and how much it reflects your own experience as being a journalist who writes so much about really heavy personal subjects.
Yeah, I think when you're writing about something that involves people's, desperate fears for their children, their fears for their own safety, sometimes their own life, when they're the most vulnerable they can be in court, and you see them in those places and you interview them about those terrible things that have happened, retaining any level of objectivity is extremely hard. And it's something that you have to constantly recheck yourself with. I am, as are other journalists in this room, contacted repeatedly by people who want you to come and cover their family court case and who tell you appalling things that have happened to them. And it's so difficult but so necessary to step back, and you are highly dependent on your editors at that point to keep testing you. At Tortoise here I work with producers. Having two people on a story makes so much difference because you're always having conversations about it and where you go and whether it's the right thing to do and the choices you're making. But it is really, really hard. Yeah.
What's it like to have spent so much time in and around the family courts as a journalist?
Oh, God, it's really hard to say that, keeping my language sort of reasonably broadcastable. It is the hardest reporting I've ever done. I'll never do anything more difficult. Because it's banned by law, you have to work with, my lovely pro bono barrister is in the audience for a case that I'm working on at the moment with Hannah Summers, who's also here. And you need people who will help you navigate your way through these incredible difficulties. And you have to give it more time than I've ever had to give any other kind of journalism. So, for instance, we're sitting here in Tortoise, which supported me and which basically supported me to look at the case of Andrew Griffiths MP, who was found in a family court to have raped and coercively controlled and abused his wife. And it took us a year. And James backed us for a year to do that case. And it cost a lot of money, and it took us right up to the Court of Appeal. And it was all at risk, and we may never have been able to say a single thing about what we knew about what he had done to his wife. And I've continued to follow all Kate Griffiths' court cases. And, just to give you an idea of how completely dysfunctional the family justice system is, from the day that she got that fact-finding judgment to when the final welfare determination about their child will happen in that case will be 3 years, just over. 3 years. And we did a year of it. So it's really frustrating and really difficult, not just because of the law, but because of the culture, which I have found often to be actively hostile, and have recently brought a case where a judge was shown not to have behaved correctly in relation to applications to report. I mean, that's putting it as politely as I possibly can.
And how well do you think the family courts work overall in making these? I mean, these are some of the hardest decisions I think that the state ever has to make. They involve really, things that there's nothing more important in some ways than how and when you get to see your own children. They touch on issues of abuse. Quite often, you're hearing two competing accounts of a very, it's a private, personal relationship, and then judges have to make these life-changing, sometimes life-ending decisions. How well do you think they're working, and what would you like to see change as somebody who's followed them over a long period of time?
So there are two separate aspects to this, I would say, and one is that family courts operate in what is essentially, it sort of tries to be inquisitorial, but really it's adversarial. And when you have people who are, highly vulnerable, often, in the vast majority of cases that I've ever followed, there's been domestic abuse. I think there's research from Refuge and CAFCAS which show that it's about 60% plus of cases involving separating couples where there are at least allegations of domestic abuse. And where you have a system like in the criminal courts where somebody who says they're a victim of rape is cross-examined about their rape, it's brutal. And I have seen women cross-examined about the domestic abuse they're alleging, which often also includes rape. And I'm thinking about two particular cases, and there was one where I don't think the barrister did anything wrong, but it was clearly highly traumatic for the woman. So just the system itself re-abuses people. And there was another case where both the cross-examination of the woman and of the man were done, I thought, so objectionably that by the end of it, I'd actually, so completely unconsciously, turned my body away because I almost couldn't, I wasn't really aware of it, and it just went on for, 10 minutes after 10 minutes after 10 minutes. And eventually I almost wasn't looking at anything to do with the court case because it was so awful. So I think the setting is actually abusive. I think it re-abuses people, and there are people who say that the experience of being in court is worse than the abuse and that they wish they'd stayed with their abuser. And then there's the actual determinations that are made about who children should live with. And I can't say that they're all right or they're all wrong because I don't have access to all the evidence in every case. But even though perhaps you wouldn't expect there to be a lot of happy people coming out of the family court, I don't know any happy people or any people who have particularly felt that they have, or their children's lives have been enhanced at all, and often they feel that they live at greater risk.
Would you scrap the system altogether and replace it with something different?
Oof.
Sorry, we'll get back to the novel in a minute. This is me, the journalist, who's really interested in this.
Oh, it's so hard that people ask that question, and it's sort of not one really for journalists to answer. How you reshape an entire system of how you protect children just feels like so far beyond my understanding or my pay grade or kind of what I can envisage. I don't know. I don't know what you do when you have someone who's saying, this person abused me, and therefore they are so risky that I can't afford for them to be able to see this child because they're going to put the child, or indeed me, in such danger. You can't just have a court going, well, yes, fine, whatever you say. But equally, if you're in a situation where you're going to test that, it's going to be horrendous for the person who's being tested. And if you can't prove it, and very often things that happened are completely not provable, even to the balance of probability standard, then you're kind of stuffed, aren't you? And I don't know what the answer is.
Cherry, the character, so she's effectively lost both her parents to domestic abuse because her father killed her mother. How do the courts deal with that situation generally, in terms of contact with the...
I don't think there's any generally, but I think, there is no doubt that parents who have convictions for violent offences get to see their children. And one of the conversations that sort of helped to inspire this novel was a conversation with a judge years and years ago, where I was kind of expressing surprise that convicted murderers might continue to see their children. And he's like, well, the court has to look at every case on its merits. And it might not be that the child is kind of wheeled to the prison gates every 2 weeks on a Friday afternoon, but different kinds of contact can be possible, can be sought, and is sometimes granted.
And to what extent, you know, to what extent are Cherry's experiences as, you know, as an adult now whose mother was killed when she was 9, hasn't been in touch with her dad, to what extent are her experiences based on those of real children who've lost parents to domestic abuse?
I think something that I wasn't quite conscious of as I was writing the novel, but which is in it, is the fact that she hasn't had a relationship at all with her father for 20 years. And as you go through the novel, you realise that for many years, while she was still a minor, he was asking the court regularly if he could have contact, and she's never had contact with him because her aunt and uncle who adopted her resisted it and the court refused it. And then, but now, as a woman in her late 20s, when he gets back in touch with her, she is not just intrigued, but there's this huge ache for him. He's her only parent, he's the only one left. And something that a psychologist said to me once was that although people can sometimes not believe that violent parents, abusive parents can be given contact to their children, children crave their parents. And there is value sometimes in a child understanding who their parent really is, rather than, as Cherry does in the novel, almost, she doesn't idealise him, but she's very curious about him. She's very curious that he says how much he loves her. He's her only parent left, and she aches for that love. And her aunt is constantly saying, he's like this, but she doesn't know, because she was 9 when she saw him last. And there's been 20 years, and she wants to go and meet him, and there's a pull that she can't resist. And it gets her into all sorts of difficult situations. And so that whole idea that a child should never have contact with a parent who's behaved in a certain way, it's not necessarily so totally cut and dried.
How did you, it's a practical question, how did you manage to write a novel while you're still working as a journalist, I guess is my question. Well, were you just like writing it all out, is it?
So as soon as you said that, I glanced over at my partner who took the kids out to swimming every Saturday, because if I look back, and swimming and Greg's. So the boys are now 15 and 12, which means it's 8 years since I first put pen to paper for that, so they were really quite small. It was really hard. There were like long periods of time when I didn't do much. There were periods of time when Jim looked after the kids while I would kind of scramble a couple of hours on a Saturday morning. There was a lot of guilt. It felt like this awful millstone around my neck for ages when I wasn't doing enough or anything, and I felt it wasn't good enough. Yeah, it was just bloody hard.
And how did you feel when you finished it?
Oh my God. like somebody had lifted the millstone off me and I could breathe again.
But you've got 2 more to go, haven't you? Because it's a trilogy.
Yes.
Have you started the second one yet?
Yes, I have. I took myself off to a friend's house who'd gone away on holiday, and Jim looked after the kids again for another 3 days while I tried to extrude the plot of number 2 out of my head. But I kind of feel like the next one hopefully will come faster. In fact, it must, because otherwise, by the time, another 8 years and another 8 years, it's just not feasible. Also my publishers are looking at me. No, I think it will be quicker. And I think I feel a bit more confident now, because when you start, you don't realise the mechanisms that you've got to, you have to, in a novel, you have to get somebody from a sofa to a door, and that's not what you do in journalism. You don't write that extraneous stuff. But if you don't write things like that in a book, then somebody appears at their car when really they should be in their flat, and you're just like, oh. It's like, but writing, Cherry got up from the table and went through the door, it just feels like you shouldn't do it, but you kind of have to. So I sort of feel like maybe I'm a little bit more comfortable with writing fiction now.
Yeah. And just finally from me, and then I'm going to open it up to questions from the audience. I just wondered if there's another work of fiction, whether it's a novel or a drama, that you particularly admire in terms of the way that it's highlighted a social injustice.
So there's a book called My Name is Leon that I think some people here will know, and that was dramatised. It was written by Kit Duvall, who is a social worker, and I read that probably about 4 or 5 years ago, just when I was kind of halfway through this, and I kind of read it and I thought, oh, this is so good. It's so good. And it's really such an incredible description of how a young boy ends up losing his family and going into foster care. And it's written with such sensitivity and understanding of the traumas that he goes through. And I mean, that's a proper work of literary fiction. This is a thriller. It's a sort of page turner. It's a different thing. But I
don't think you should be doing it down.
well, but I would recommend My Name is Leon because it's an amazing book.
Great, excellent. Has anyone in the audience got any questions for Louise?
Oh.
Excellent. I can see a question here at the front.
Okay, microphone. Hello. I was just wondering if you could force a whole particular group of people to read your book,
Oh,
who would you choose?
that's so good.
What would you hope that they'd take away from it?
Well, I was a bit scared there might be a judge in the audience. I would love some judges to read it. I would really love some judges to read it. There's a very nasty judge in the novel, and they're not like that. But there's a judge who behaves really very badly from bad motivations. That's the audience that I think I'd love to read it, but maybe won't read it, or if they do read it, they might not like it.
Or they might read it and think, I'm nothing like
If
that.
they,
yes.
what would you hope that they would reflect from it? And
I think what I hope they would take from it is just the sheer vulnerability of. I think people who work in the family justice system, the ones who I have met, have generally speaking been excellent people and very sensitive. But I think judges have to make so many decisions in such short periods of time with partial and sometimes not good information. And I think they become desensitized to what I would say about the family justice system is it does not understand domestic abuse. It doesn't understand the deep trauma that even minor domestic abuse and the triggering fear that it leaves victims with. And the idea that some domestic abuse, if it's kind of like more than a year or 2 years old, can be viewed as historic and therefore not relevant to the way that a family is dealt with is utterly ludicrous in my view, having interviewed in depth so many victims of abuse and seen how it will never leave them. It will never, ever leave them. Because I think most of them understand very clearly that they could lose their lives. And some do. And we all know that they do, and they do regularly, and the numbers are not going down. Yeah.
Any more questions? Oh, gentleman over here.
You absolutely don't have to answer this question.
Oh.
Have your kids read any of your novel?
No, they're too young, really. Also, uninterested.
Would you like them to when they're older?
I did talk to Jim about whether, Sam our older one might like to watch this, or, at some point, whether he thought he could read it. I would like them to read it. Yeah, I would. Because I have deliberately not made the characters in the novel that... As a domestic abuse victim, you don't have to be an attractive character. As an abuser, you don't have to be an unattractive character. I've deliberately blurred those lines, and I don't think we should be looking for perfect victims or obvious abusers, because it doesn't happen like that. And I want them to understand the subtleties of how abuse can play out. And so, although I know many murders that have been grotesque and hideous and so awful that they would have been dramatically amazing to have, written things that are something like that, they would also not be the experience of most people who are abused, because it mostly doesn't get to that point. But the people who are abused will always know it could.
Thank you for that.
Could I ask a question then? Is the issue more to do with the ongoing abuse rather than the end product?
In the book?
In reality. Because if you are in an abuse situation with a mother with children, what are your options?
Lots of parents who have been abused do not object to their other parent seeing children, as long as it's safe. If you are someone who feels, with the knowledge and the understanding you have of that person, built up usually over years, of how they've treated you and often the children, and remember the children now in law are seen as victims if they have even been in the vicinity of abuse, then your options are, if your abuser is determined, your options are really you have to go to court, or you may be taken to court by them and have no option in the matter and have to be a respondent in a case. I don't think I'm answering your question very well.
Well, it's more to do with the end situation that we discussed, which was the disaster.
Oh yeah, okay, the murder, yeah.
You don't want to be there, do you?
No.
And what I see a lot of situations in conversations with friends where there's elements of this existing in their lives, but there's no real option for people to really report it or manage it or express it. And then it builds up because families are all meant to be cosy, great institutions, but...
Well, if you're asking what options are there for people who are being abused, I think for lots of them, they tolerate it for very, very, very long periods of time because the costs of leaving to them feel too great. I think it has to be pretty extreme before people will report. I mean, Brian Woods, who made the dispatches that I made about domestic abuse in the family courts, and I are looking at trying to get a film commissioned about how middle-class women find it very difficult to report domestic abuse, and how the understanding of that being something that they suffer is very, very low in society. It's seen as something that happens with people who are working class and poor, and it absolutely isn't the case. The very first person who I ever knew personally who was being abused lived in a castle, and she'd bought the castle because she had sold her big PR firm for enormous amounts of money, and when I met her, she was living in the cellars of the castle and he was living in the top rooms. They were separated by then, but they hadn't quite managed to, get rid of the castle and move on. And it couldn't have been a bigger, a better or more eloquent description of what that relationship was like than that. But the costs are huge of moving on, particularly if you have children.
Yeah, not everybody lives in a castle.
No.
I guess one of the issues around understanding of domestic abuse, and in the courts as well in particular, is that abuse is a pattern of behaviour. It's not one particular incident and another incident. And so I guess actually, there's just a question that I wanted to ask, which is, the courts are supposed to be better at recognising that now. We've now got law that defines coercive control as a pattern of behaviour. But how good are they at getting their heads around that, in your experience?
It's so difficult because, I'm not in every court and I don't see the number of cases that, the two barristers we have here, three barristers, she's still there, we'll see. But I give you the example of Kate Griffiths, so Andrew Griffiths' wife, who gloriously took his seat after he stepped down. She got an amazing fact-finding judgment represented by a barrister here. And that was the one that Tortoise and I tried to publish and in the end successfully did. It was very subtle. It totally seemed to understand coercive control as well as physical assault and as well as rape. Difficult thing for courts to understand coercive control. The judge did such a great job, and you look at the judgment, you think, wow. And then the same judge subsequently ordered Kate Griffiths to share the costs of supervised contact with her rapist, because he argued to the court that he was impecunious, and she was there going, I'm having to pay half of the costs of his contact, which we're only having to have supervised because he's raped and abused me and is a risk to our child. And she took it to appeal, and Charlotte represented her. And at the appeal, she won, and there was an amazing judgment. But that cost thousands more. And so now, yes, there is a really important judgment saying that although the judge can't say that there will never be an occasion when a domestic abuse victim should have to share the costs of her rapist's contact, in most cases, probably that should not happen. But that's the same judge did the amazing judgment about abuse and then ordered her to do this ludicrous thing that most people look at and gasp.
Any more questions? The lady at the back in the polka dots.
The family court system is without doubt completely broken. There's no question about that. And the situation isn't going to improve for victims of domestic violence unless those cases which don't need to be in the court system are moved out. One One of the big problems is that for the family law profession, of which I have to profess to be one, it's not something that actively one would encourage, because sadly and cynically, lawyers make more money loitering around the corridors of the court in a delay-ridden system. So the only way really is to encourage the public to understand that there are better and different ways of resolving disputes, so that the courts can be used for those people who really need it. And so my question is, as a journalist, how would you raise that profile within the public domain, and what would you encourage those lawyers who would like to keep people out of court rather more to contribute to doing that?
Well, I don't think journalism can do everything. I think the idea of me going to James and saying, can I do a story about people keeping out of court isn't going to get a great response, because it doesn't raise an issue. So, I mean, I know somebody who was perfectly happy for her ex-husband to have contact with their kids, and whose ex-husband did have regular contact with their kids. But for some reason, he insisted on going to court to get a court order saying he could have contact with their kids. And she said that, you know, they turned up at court and the judge was like, what are we doing here? What are we doing here? It's a waste of time, public money, public resource. And is that the kind of thing that you mean?
Yeah, no,
yeah.
Exactly. It's total
I
waste
don't
of
know
time.
how to educate people who are in perfectly, you know, reasonable agreement about their children not to do things. I want, you know, is it people's insecurities? I have no idea what it is.
People think the court delivers justice and retribution, and it
No,
doesn't.
no,
And it
no.
just doesn't.
No.
And that's why they end up there. And of course, it's not trendy enough to highlight things like mediation or arbitration on EastEnders.
Well,
'cause it
also,
doesn't
I mean,
pull
we
watchers.
can't get access to those things anyway, really. How would I get access to go and see a mediation session or be able to write about it completely honestly? No, that is almost impossible.
Well, there was a TV programme
There was.
donkeys years ago, about 20 years ago, which I was sort of involved in. And the problem with it was that nobody wanted to be filmed except the sort of people on whom, sadly, the spotlight doesn't often shine. And therefore, the representation of what mediation was like was so hugely skewed by the people involved with it that it didn't do the job at all and was rather a waste of money.
Yeah.
But I'm very interested in ideas of just raising public awareness, and it's as you say, it's very, very difficult to do.
Yeah.
But the public have a completely wrong idea of what the court system can achieve, and until that misapprehension is changed, that broken system doesn't have the time capacity to deal with the people who really need it.
No.
Thank you. I'm going to take a couple more questions because I think this is going to be the last round. So actually, I'll take three because I've seen three hands. So Charlotte, Thrisha, and then the gentleman at the back. Sorry, but I just want everyone to get their question to you in.
As a journalist going into the family courts, what do you think is one of, or maybe even three, key changes that you think are needed to encourage other journalists to go in, and also to make it easier for you to report on some of these cases? Because obviously I know you speak a lot about transparency and open justice, and that's part of it. I know you and Hannah are doing amazing work, as are many others in this field, but conscious as well about what you speak about in the book, about the boundaries and some of the challenges that you come up against in terms of reporting.
Well, it would be really refreshing not to try and attend a family court hearing and have to field objections from every party based on none of the relevant grounds, and then have to desperately try and explain in as polite terms as you can to a judge who might be trying to exclude you, also on none of the relevant grounds, that he's acting unlawfully. So a change in culture would be super helpful. Just a general acceptance that there is a reason, you know, why journalists should be in court. Nick Wallace, who followed the Amber Heard and Johnny Depp trial and also followed the whole of the post office scandal, I mean, he says that courts treat journalists like the dirt on your shoe. I wouldn't quite put it as badly as that, but you do not generally feel welcome. It's an exception, and that shouldn't be the case, I think. Maybe this is idealistic, but judges should want you there. People should want a journalist in court. You have the president of the family division saying, I've set up this marvellous pilot in 3 pilot courts, why aren't journalists reporting more? It's like, well, when Hannah and I try to report more, it's really difficult to get access. Links are not sent to us to remote hearings, so we miss them. Judges get arsey when we raise the point that their clerks haven't sent us those links. And you're ending up, making a complaint to the Judicial Complaints Authority, which is not a place that you want to be as a journalist. So it's a culture change. That's the first thing. I think the law should be changed so that there is a presumption that you can report anonymously on what you see. I have seen no evidence of any anonymisation mistakes in reporting by journalists on the family courts. None. And yet there is such suspicion of us. On the other hand, I have seen numerous, I'm looking at Julie Doughty here, who will know this, numerous anonymisation mistakes in judgments that have been uploaded to Bailey and the National Archives that would highly identify families. And were they not caught by charities like the Transparency Project, of which Julie is a trustee, and instantly notified to the Judicial Office Press Office, those judgments would be public and those families would be identifiable. So I think we can be trusted because we've shown we can.
Thresher.
You've been careful. You've written a page turner, and
so.
we can't wait to read it. You've been careful to not be didactic. You said that the perpetrator can be, it's not black and white. You mentioned that journalists, or as a journalist, it's beyond your capacity to say what reform or what change you might want to see. Is there anything in the novel that talks to misogyny and patriarchy within the court system? And because you haven't mentioned that, and I wondered, or have you left that also to sort of to the characters? And
well, I didn't want to. I had to cut 50,000 words because there was loads of exposition all about how to do journalism and all about what I thought about the family court system. And it was 150,000 words at the point at which I started sending it out to agents, and the feedback was like, whoa, it's too long. And I blame my partner for this because he'd seen it first and he hadn't, and he's a journalist and an editor, and he hadn't said cut 50,000 words. He's just like, it's all really good.
I did say cut it.
It's so tempting to kind of give your own views in the novel, but that's not what it was about for me. I mean, at the end, there is a really definite ending, but I sort of hope it's a surprise.
You can write a column.
I can write a column if I want to say what I think.
And lastly, we'll go to the gentleman at the back. Yep.
So just to return to a question earlier about ways of raising other alternative ways of resolving family matters, perhaps that will be your second book.
Well, the second book is sketched out now. And the family court system doesn't come in for such a pasting, although it is in there. It's more the police and social services that come in for the pasting in the second novel.
Great. Well, I think the time has come to sort of draw the formal bit of the evening to a close anyway. Louise, huge thanks to you for speaking to us about the book. I found it a really interesting conversation, and also massive congratulations. It's a huge achievement, debut novel while you've been a journalist as well. So, congratulations.
Thank you.
And will you be hanging around a bit to sign books?
I just want to say one thing before we all go and get another drink. I did have 2 glasses of champagne earlier today, but no more than that because I had to be able to speak. I wouldn't have been able to write this novel, and I've said this in the acknowledgements, without all the editors that have commissioned me over the last 10 to 15 years, who have allowed me the scope to be able to go out and investigate these kinds of stories and spend the time getting to know how domestic abuse operates in its dynamic and how the family justice system works. And so thanks so much to James for hosting this event at Tortoise, where I've worked for the last 3 years on these kinds of stories. And thanks so much to the journalists and editors from The Guardian who've commissioned me and helped me in my work over the years before that. Thank you.